welcome everybody back to the Land Between the Meadows, the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm here, Mr. Cable, the Kentucky Spotlight. We got Dr. Theiss, Dr. Nancy Theiss, and she is the Executive Director of the Oldham County Historical Center. She's had writings featured in the Courier Journal, the Oldham Era, and she's also a former teacher, which marks her high on my book. But what brings her here today is a recently released book, A Tour on the Underground Railroad along the Ohio River. Dr. Theiss, how you doing? And we're glad to have you.
Thank you. I appreciate the invite.
Good. Real quickly, I guess, with most guests that we have on here, what's your connection to Kentucky? And tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm just a farm girl, still on the same farm I grew up. Grew up in Oldham County, outside LaGrange, and I married my high school sweetheart for Oldham County High School. And I started working at the Oldham County History Center in 2004. So I've been here 16 years. But my background really is biology and then environmental history. So when this job came up at the History Museum, Oldham County History Center, it was kind of an area I wasn't used to, but my PhD work I was studying a man named Aldo Leopold, naturalist, wrote a book called A Sand County Almanac. And he felt like in order to make the environment better and to become better stewards, humans, to help with the environmental crisis, that we need to know our history.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the background that I put to this and what I do here at the Oldham County History Center. Because really growing up here, I didn't know any history about the county. And so it's been an adventure for me to be here. We have thousands and thousands of papers and records and family papers and documents and artifacts. Our county was founded in 1824. And because of these court records, there were all these slave documents. Were totally unprepared for.
Yeah.
So, it's been a journey. Slavery was something I never thought that I would be studying or doing in scholarly work, but because of the records that we have here, it's turned into quite an amazing story of a lot of interesting people.
Well, and it's very interesting. You talk about documents and how important they are to kind of, I guess, paint that picture of history. And I guess I'll ask you, with the courthouse, did the courthouse or anything ever burn in Oldham County? Or
yeah, that's a really good question, because a lot of the courthouses did burn. And so you grew up, you said, in Rockcastle County and county area. Yeah, Oldham County was very fortunate. The courthouse did not burn. Well, actually, the courthouse did burn in the 1870s, but the court records were in a separate building.
Wow.
So that's why we got these records. And but in a lot of cases, particularly during the Reconstruction, there was some guerrilla warfare going on. Courthouses did burn down to the ground. Yeah, and that's Rockcastle's courthouse burnt twice, I believe, and then Lincoln County's, though, never burned, and all their records are kind of there, which is really good as far as documenting history. There's a museum there, right? Stanford County, and there's a history museum there.
Yeah, right by the little depot. I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
I don't know. Are your court records stored in a courthouse?
Yes. I believe so, yeah.
Okay. I remember Mrs. Kamenish that used to work at that museum in Stanford. She was very devoted to it. So you're lucky to have a museum there.
Yeah, and it's one of those things you can go to a library or a courthouse and spend a lot of time there if you don't keep yourself contained.
Yes, I get diverted all the time.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about your book, kind of what inspired your book. I've read it, but I don't want to give away too much. I would prefer people to kind of go and get it themselves. But tell us a little bit about your book.
I appreciate you reading it. So when I started here in 2004, because of these records, one of the first exhibits I felt like we had to do here was African American history, because it's a history that just has not been recognized and documented very well. So we did a exhibit, and we have formed an African American committee here of local people who grew up here that actually were so excited to have a chance to work on their family histories. That we found a man named Henry Bibb. I just actually searched him on the internet, and I found that he was enslaved by a man named William Gatewood. William Gatewood was one of our first justice of the peace. And we took Henry's book and we worked with Henry County and Trimble County historical societies, and we followed his book, and we found that all these places that he talked about when he was a slave are still here because of the rural area.
Yeah.
So we pulled in Janine Kreinbrink, who's our archaeologist, and Doug Von Tro. They have their own company, and we started doing archaeology. We had a small grant from the Kentucky Heritage Council, and we started doing archaeology on Henry Bibb, and from thence forward, we just started getting all of these stories and connections through Henry about people on the Underground Railroad.
Yeah.
And so by 2016, you see, it's taken quite a process. We've probably had hundreds of people that have worked on the archaeology site, which is in Trimble County, but that was Oldham County prior to 1836. We got 2 sites designated with the National Park Service National Underground Railroad Network. One of those is the Bibb Escapes Gatewood Plantation, and the other is our own archives building where we have some slave documents with the Mount family. These are actually slave transition papers and bounty hunter papers. We got 2 sites on the National Park Service National Underground Railroad Network, and that's what we've always... With the National Park Service, this program was established in 1998. And it takes a lot of documentation to get there. We're very proud of that. So this book was inspired by the work that we have done over the years. And it occurred to me with 20 some odd years of this network in existence, there's been an incredible amount of authors and historians and researchers and small towns along the Ohio River that have documented these Underground Railroad sites and connected and made connections with people. So I thought a tour book would be great because a lot of people don't realize this and they don't understand the Underground Railroad. Yeah. And all these small towns and big towns have spent a lot of energy and time on working on the research of the Underground Railroad. So that's why I wrote the tour book. Last year I went up and down the river, my husband and I. We started from Evansville and went all the way up to Ripley, Ohio on the free soil side. Yeah. And then on the slave soil side, which is mainly Kentucky, 654 miles of the Ohio River run along Kentucky. That's 664 miles of opportunity for people to escape. And so on the Kentucky side, it goes from Maysville to Owensboro.
Yeah. Well, the one thing I find, or it might be a misconception of my own, is how big of a role the Underground Railroad or Kentucky played in the Underground Railroad. I mean, it was literally the last step. And if somebody got to this point, crossing the river was really the last goal.
And there's a couple of things you have to realize about the Ohio River 150 years or more ago. First of all, it was about half its size. So it was full of shallows. In the summer, there's certain places that it got really, really shallow, like Madison in Indiana, across Trimble County, Kentucky. The river, you could almost wade across times. And then there was all kinds of transportation. So leading up to the Civil War, there were 2 big canals that were built. One was in Evansville and one was up in Cincinnati that went up to the Lake Erie. So those would be natural ways for people to follow if they were making their way on the Underground or they're making their way on escape. They could use those routes. People who were fugitives and running away could also hop on trains, which they did. But mainly leading up to this Civil War, the steamboat era was huge. Yes. I mean, hundreds of boats, not just, a month, but a week going up and down the Ohio River, which Henry Bibb, for instance, the first time he escaped from the Gatewood plantation, he asked Gatewood if he could go work down into the pork factories in Madison. They had a lot of hog factories and stuff, or killing slaughterhouses. And so when he went down there, he must have met some people because he didn't know about the Underground Railroad. And he on a steamboat and went up to Cincinnati. And then he went on up to Perryville, Ohio, Perrysburg, Ohio. And then he came back for his wife and daughter. So what I found out was there were so many connections of people that knew each other. So that was his experience.
Well, the thing you mentioned, and I bring this up, is the importance of Louisville and how how big the steamboat pretty much kind of made Louisville more populous, more of the big city, to say the least. So
what I found out mainly during this time period, the Underground Railroad was very loosely organized. In fact, the National Park Service doesn't really know how many thousands of people escaped slavery on their own. Mm-hmm. A lot of them we'll never know about. A lot of them probably didn't have assistance. But it got more organized closer to the buildup of the Civil War because there were more people, there was more transportation opportunities. It was really interesting. The free presses became small enough where people could make their own newspapers and flyers, pamphlets. Mm-hmm. And then two major cities were along the Ohio River at this time: Cincinnati, which was on the free soil side, and then Louisville, which was on the slave soil side. And Louisville became a real slave trading city. Mm-hmm. Then there was Evansville as well. But the two major ports were Cincinnati and Louisville. So here you have Louisville as a slave trading city. Go upriver, there's Cincinnati. Mm-hmm. So there's two big distinctions that were happening. And a lot of different efforts were going on between those two towns.
Yeah. So with and I really like the way you set up the book more as a tour, and you kind of mentioned the different places you can go. I guess if you were to pick, if you could go to one spot, which one would be the most, the best in your mind to go and visit?
I really like that's a really hard question.
Yeah.
I love both Cincinnati and Louisville, and then I loved Maysville, and I hadn't been to Augusta. I wrote the book so you can kind of go from west to east and pick these areas at a time. I don't really have a favorite spot. What was exciting to me was that I found there were certain towns, Louisville, Madison, and Cincinnati, where people on the Underground Railroad knew each other and worked together. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it really started for me when I went up to I loved going to these small museums. And in Cincinnati, they have the Beecher Stowe House. Well, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Yeah. And she came to Cincinnati, her father came to teach at Lane Seminary. And he came at a time when there was a lot of disruption and a lot more people escaping. Mm-hmm. And Beecher Stowe fell in love with her husband, who was teaching at Lane Seminary, and he was a big abolitionist. Yeah. So Harriet and her husband both became very interested in the Underground Railroad, and they worked with people like Salmon Chase, attorney, James Burney, who had been a former slave owner. He was down in Danville, and he started an abolitionist newspaper, and he moved to Cincinnati. Mm-hmm. Then there was a man named John Rankin up in Ripley, Ohio. Mm-hmm. His son, and John Rankin's huge Presbyterian minister, abolitionist. He apparently assisted several thousand people up in that area, up in Maysville. His son attended Lane Seminary, and Harriet Beecher Stowe became familiar with John Rankin. And then all at once, there's this web of people that all were starting to interact with each other. Henry Bibb, on his final escape, he has a miserable tale. It's amazing he survived it. He ends up in Canada, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, all of these people, they hear of Henry Bibb. Georgia Baptiste, who had helped Henry Bibb down in Madison, he moves up to Detroit. There's another woman named Laura Haviland up in that Michigan area, has an anti-slavery campaign. Mm-hmm. They don't know about the people down in Cincinnati. Yeah. They all, it's not some disjointed thing that happens. And so when you see what's happening between Louisville and Cincinnati and the steamboats and the people up and down the river, another really important couple was the Coffins. Levi and Catherine Coffin. I don't know. I was just, when I went through each town and I began to walk through the footsteps of the people I was reading about, it was just mesmerizing.
Yeah.
When I grew up in Louisville and I go down on Main Street in the Wharf area, I documented so many slave jails there. Henry describes them. And they have a marker out across from the stadium there where U of L plays, right on the street. People were selling people right out on the street. So they were holding people and waiting for the next boat to ship them downriver. That's what they did with Henry Bibb.
Yeah.
And then I found out there's this man named W.H. Gibson, black man. There was a whole society of free blacks, like 800.
Wow.
And they had churches they worked through. And then Gibson described some of the people there who were assisting others who were slaves to go upriver to Cincinnati or go to New Albany. I mean, it just blew my mind. It was really interesting.
Yeah. Well, you talk about a network being formed, and almost like a movement. And I've read. You're probably aware because I know you mentioned Berea College of John G. Fee, and we talked about him on our show a few months ago.
Amazing.
And I mean, these people were. I mean, they were really. I guess you could call some of them became pariahs. They were outcast. I mean, by standing up for against.
Well, they were real rebels. They were really.
Yeah.
John and his wife Matilda, many times. He was a preacher. He grew up in Augusta, one of those little towns, beautiful river town. They still have a ferry that operates there.
Yeah.
Which is really fun. I mean, every day throughout the year, you can go from Ohio across the ferry there at Augusta. John Gregory Fee was a Presbyterian minister. He and his wife around Augusta. Anti-slavery, would go into churches and preach. People, they would harass him. Many times he was threatened with his life, wife, both. Very, very amazing man. And he continues, no matter what adversarial situation happens, he just continues and continues and continues against the cause of slavery. And so he ends up establishing Berea College along with Cassius Clay. They're big abolitionists. And then when Camp Nelson is formed by Abraham Lincoln around 1863 to recruit black soldiers to fight for the Union, there's John Gregory Fee down there helping to feed and find refugee camps for the families that also went to Nicholasville, outside Nicholasville, because Camp Nelson was this big free soil in the middle of a slave state. Yeah. So he's just all over the place. And the incredible courage. And I also don't want to miss out when I was talking about Gibson. This was a movement started by black people. I mean, Underground Railroad started when the first enslaved person escaped from slavery. So it became a network of blacks who it was extended out into other groups and enlisted people for the cause. Oberlin College up in Ohio became a college that recruited people to become Underground Railroad conductors. You have Delia Webster, who went to Oberlin College. She goes down to Lexington, meets Calvin Fairbank, who's a big abolitionist. They help Lewis Hayden and his family escape as they were enslaved in Lexington. They come up through the road, the Paris Pike, out through Maysville. The Haydens successfully escape. But Delia Webster and Calvin Fairbank are caught, and they are thrown in to the penitentiary. Delia gets out. Calvin Fairbank spends up to 14 years.
Wow.
Lewis Hayden, he and his wife end up in Canada. They become Underground Railroad conductors. They end up in Maryland. And he becomes one of the first black state representatives in their state. And his son, he recruits blacks for the Union. His son fought for the Union and died. And then he and his wife established a scholarship program at Harvard University for blacks.
Mm-hmm.
Incredible, all
incredible people.
These people, yeah. Puts himself, he and his wife, many times in danger. So I'm telling you, the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act was a game changer, because once they act, and I might say that people like Henry Clay was one of the people that pushed that act, that allowed for bounty hunters to cross and sheriffs to cross the river to seek people who were runaways.
Yeah.
That drove more people who had been enslaved, and they were fugitives. That drove them farther up to Canada.
Yeah.
So, and also, when Harriet Beecher wrote her book Uncle Tom's Cabin, I found that they were all on Kentuckians.
Mm-hmm.
The Uncle Tom model was Josiah Henson.
Yeah.
And he ends up being enslaved, ends up down in Owensboro.
Mm-hmm.
Finally escapes, makes it with his family to Canada. He even goes to England. The Queen sent for him. She wanted to meet him to talk about his story.
Yeah. That's a lot. It's good. Well, you think about just the struggle that they endured just to get to the river, and then, as you said, in 1850 when they did that Fugitive Slave Act, that just made things even more difficult.
Yeah, and the people, Kentucky, some people say it wasn't that bad in Kentucky for people who were enslaved. Well, it was pretty awful in Kentucky. The Anderson Slave Pen Jail in Cincinnati in the Freedom Center, he would go around the countryside and recruit for young blacks who were enslaved, and then put them in his slave pen, which was on his farm. That's Germantown up in around Mason County. And then he would ship them down when he had enough to make it profitable down river. The archaeologist, Janine, who worked with us on the Bibb site, she was the one that helped deconstruct and reconstruct that slave pen.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
So when I looked at it in Oldham County, the Mounts, James Mount, which I'm sitting in the office, it was once their house, he was a jailer.
Yeah.
And on these slave traders, they would send people out to the jailers in the counties. Mm-hmm. They had slaves that no one claimed. They would buy them from the local jailers. Of course, each county would get the money from that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Also, if you were a slave owner, you had to pay property taxes. So every county that was, in states that had slaves, they all made money. They all profited from that.
Mm-hmm. From a property, from a tax.
Yeah, and there's a thing this was really crazy to me, Jameson. Let me see if I can find it. When I was doing research, I went to the Free Public Library in Louisville. Mm-hmm. And this is an ad I came up with. I don't know how well you can see that.
Yeah. I can see that pretty good.
Okay, that's a daily ad.
Wow. Man. That is that's sad, that it's that well.
I'm talking about, wanted 300, wanted 250. These are all agents listed. Mm-hmm. This Louisville Daily Democrat. See, this I took from the Louisville Daily Democrat, June 30th, 1860.
Wow.
It's amazing.
It is.
That was going on.
Well, and you said that sometimes people say it wasn't as bad in Kentucky, but for slaves. But I mean, that's an impossible statement to say. If they're slaves, it's bad.
Right. Well, people were tortured. They were separated from family. If a slaveholder had problems, they often either tortured that person or they separated them from their families.
Yeah.
Let's see. I had a thing that Henry Bibb wrote about what it was like to be in the Louisville jail workhouse. He said, "I'd not been in this prison many days before Madison Garrison, the soul driver, bought me and my family to sell to the New Orleans slave market. The workhouse of Loyola was a very large brick building built on the plan of a jail or state's prison with many apartments to it, divided off into cells. The prison was enclosed by a high stone wall. When the large iron gate or door was thrown open to receive us, it was astonishing to see so many whites as well as colored men loaded down with irons at hard labor under the supervision of overseers. The people of color who were in there were slaves there without crime but for safekeeping, while the whites were of some of the most abandoned characters living. The keeper took me up to the anvil block and fastened a chain about my leg, which I had to drag after me both day and night during the 3 months.
Wow.
Was sawing stone. My food was coarse cornbread and beef shanks and cow's heads with pot liquor and a very scanty allowance of that. I have often seen the meat spoiled when brought to us, covered with flies and fly blows, and even worms crawling over it, when we were compelled to eat it or go without anything at all. It was all spread out on a long table in separate plates, and at the sound of a bell, everyone would take his plate, asking no questions.
Oh, that sounds... they treat them like people like animals. That's...
Yeah, they pretty much were.
Yeah.
There was a good friend of John Theiss when he was growing up, and her name was Juliet Miles. Mm-hmm. Well, as much as he despised slavery, his father was a slaveholder.
Yeah, yeah.
And so in this Juliet Miles case, he begged his father to set her free. Mm-hmm. And when he finally, it says she was enslaved by John Gregory's father, John. Sophie purchased Miles and emancipated Juliet and her son Henry in 1851. Mm-hmm. Then they moved to Felicity, Ohio, about 16 miles from her enslaved family in Kentucky. So in 1858, she came back, and she was arrested and captured on the banks of the Ohio River close to Augusta, where she was attempted to help her enslaved children and grandchildren escape. Matilda and her children were thrown into a local jail. Both Matilda and John Theiss spoke up for Juliet, but to no avail. Mm-hmm. John Theiss's brother, who owned the enslaved children, sold them and separated them from her. They were shipped to the New Orleans slave markets. Miles spent a cold winter in the local Oldham County jail. And her trial in February, she was sentenced to 3 years in the Kentucky penitentiary. The case was highly publicized. John and Matilda visited Juliet at the state penitentiary. She was said to have pined herself to death, and she died in prison after serving 2 years. Mm-hmm. Never got to see her family again.
Yeah.
Then there's the Margaret Garner story in Cincinnati, where the woman crossed the Ohio River with her children. Mm-hmm. She was on the Cincinnati side. She slit the throats of her children because she wanted them to be into slavery again. So Toni Morrison's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel called Beloved is based on Margaret Garner's story.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, these are some heavy stories. I mean, they're moving, and in a way, it really kind of paints gets a clear picture of what people were going through and how terrible they were having it.
Well, it was an exciting time in American history because it showed that people worked together to cooperate in an effort that, in spite of the torture and in spite of the separation of families, people knew it was unjust. They worked together and they won. They defeated slavery, but it was at a great cost. And if all of that would have just happened without a war, they knew, people who held slaves at this time, the slaveholders knew that the system of slavery was breaking down.
Yeah.
Time the Civil War happened, Great Britain, the cotton markets, which really drove slavery in this country. Great Britain was starting to trade more with China and India, different places across the world for the textile industry.
Mm-hmm.
And people were, more and more against slavery. But unfortunately, due to the stubbornness of the slaveholders who did not want to give up their property, i.e., their enslaved,
power, yeah,
they didn't want to give up the money. We had slaveholders here named, they were the Taylors, Martin Taylor and his wife Elizabeth Bett Taylor. They had a house here in Oldham County, mentioned, but they also had a 10,000-acre cotton plantation in Arkansas, which I visited, and they had 180 enslaved people there.
Wow.
So the average going for a slave at that time would have been, well, it just depends. We have a slave here, George, who Man and Mount bought for $1,200, but he had 180 people, and the average was $1,000. And really, in today's market, they'd be more like $10,000 to $20,000.
Yeah.
So just to lose their, they were so bent up. I mean, to lose that amount of money. It didn't matter about the human suffering. It didn't matter that a civil war would have caused millions of deaths. It's greed.
Yeah, that's what it comes down to. People being well greedy. I mean, there's no other way to say it. So switching over to something else you got coming up, a project you have coming up in September, the 30 Stories in 30 Days. And since this is
you're going to participate.
Yep. And since this is a podcast and people be listening to this on podcasts, I hope to be able to, get these people to check out this the podcast you got going on. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, we're doing it because the National Park Service, National Underground Railroad Network, wants to promote International Underground Railroad Month of September. And Maryland signed a proclamation last year. So they're trying to get more states to sign proclamations, of which we have petitioned for a proclamation for Kentucky, and we're waiting to see if that will happen. But in the meantime, we thought it would be very interesting if for the month of September, in observation of the International Underground Railroad Month, that we would read a story each day about the Underground Railroad in Kentucky. And so we've recruited people like yourself and others. We have authors that will be reading. We have historians, researchers. We have local people that are going to read, people that are just interested and love history. So we've lined them all up, and they'll be reading a story each day. The podcast series is actually sponsored by our Oldham County Chamber of Commerce, and they came and asked us if we would be interested in developing a podcast series. And it just happened. It was serendipity that we were working on the proclamation, and I thought, well, that would be really cool if we did a story a day. And I just written this book, so I have the stories documented and the research, but I also have used a lot of other authors to promote their books too. So each day we'll have a host. It won't necessarily be me, and they'll be producing like yourself. And then some people will be reading their own stories, like the authors that have written. Yeah. And then some of the people who are participating will be reading stories that we have given.
So which that's one thing I've always enjoyed the most about history is their stories, that people's stories, and you can relate to them a lot now, and they can really help humble you in a way that is always uplifting, or that everybody always needs, I guess.
Yeah, and W.H. Gibson in the free black community in Louisville, for instance, he talks about some of the conductors. He brings up some people like Washington Spradling, a really interesting black businessman in Louisville who would buy enslaved people and set them free. He was a developer. He worked with his brother. His brother later went up to Cincinnati to be a conductor, worked with Levi and Catherine Coffin and all the people up there. So all of these kind of people that I didn't know about, and I don't think a lot of people do know. And also, I don't think people know about the connection. Like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which as time went past was criticized because of some of the vernacular, and people thought that Harriet Beecher Stowe made people look like they were helpless, was just the opposite. I mean, the Uncle Tom for Josiah Henson, and who gave up everything for his honor, you know, you learn about the real man. I mean, she really picked some people. Some of the Liza Harris in her story, the woman that crossed the river with a babe in her arms, true story. I mean, so she wrote this fictitious novel, but it's actually based
on real. And
so that was interesting to me.
Kentuckians, in my view, are awesome. What do you have any other future writing plans? Anything like that you've thought about? Or
yeah, we always. I write a lot. I did a book 2 years ago on a man named Rob Morris. He was founder of the Order of the Eastern Star, or at Freemasonry. I'm a member of the Order of the Eastern Star. So his biography based on some letters that we have here at the state headquarters for the order. And I've written a couple books on Oldham County history. I do write columns. There's some more books in the future, but I don't know what they are right now. I just finished this one this year. So I try to keep, but I like to write. Writing's a lot of fun for me. And in the Underground Railroad, I just did this tour book because I felt like I wanted to make a better connection for people to be able to find these stories. I want people to get out on their own and these sites because, it happens right here. And I think you can visualize history better if you can actually go to the place.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that we've tried to do on the podcast is try to promote, places that you can go to and actually see what we may be talking about or what's local. I mean, every county in Kentucky has some sort of history that they can, people can go and check out.
They do. I've had different jobs. I worked for the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife. I've got to go out to so many different places I wouldn't have gone ordinarily. And then worked in education and been all over the state. I mean, I love Kentucky, and Kentucky was such a border ground for so many places. It was the gateway to the West. It was the border for the Underground Railroad. It's the home of bourbon. Who cannot like that? So many different things that we have here. We had Thomas Jefferson. We have Abraham Lincoln. I mean, it's not Thomas Jefferson. We had
Jefferson Davis.
Jefferson Davis, and Abraham Lincoln. And so there's just a real yin and a yang here. It's a good place for it.
It is. Typically, towards the end of the episode, I give the guest a history quiz about the county they're from.
Oh, okay.
And you've already answered one of these questions already when you were talking.
Okay.
Are you ready for it? I'm pretty sure you're going to do fine on this. There's not going to be.
Okay.
All right. First question. Where does Oldham County get its name?
Okay. Well, this was a Colonel Oldham who actually probably never lived in Oldham County. He died before Oldham County was formed in 1824. It was popular to name counties for some of the War of 1812 and Indian War. So we have a statue of him out in the courthouse. He was, so that's who it's named after.
Yeah, and that's
in a battle on the Wabash River, I think.
And you mentioned that so many of Kentucky counties are named after people from Virginia, other places, founding fathers, or a war hero, and those people never even came to Kentucky.
Right, he probably never set foot. I think he had property actually in Louisville. This was Jefferson County. To be fair, it was Jefferson County at the time that he was alive, but he died before the county was founded.
All right. Well, next question was, what year was the county founded? And I think you already said that earlier.
24. Yeah.
What have been the county seats in Oldham County?
Yeah, we started out on the river at Westport, and that was, again, that was the gateway to the West. People would stop in Westport before they reached Louisville, before they reached Ohio.
Yeah.
So Westport was a pretty interesting place. The old courthouse, our original courthouse, is still intact down there. That's a Methodist church. We put a historical marker down there because we wanted to recognize it. And that was where William Gatewood, served as Justice of the Peace while he was enslaved Henry Bibb's family. So it's a beautiful little town.
So Westport and
then LaGrange. The county seat moved to LaGrange in 1836, 1838.
Which is an interesting move because you're talking about the river and Sword, and it's that was the highway. You want to be close to the highway, as in now, a town close to an interstate is going to be a bit more.
Yeah, that's exactly. The train came to Oldham County, and LaGrange really started growing. The train came here, I think, in 1854. So it became a train town, and the river traffic, it was still important, but the train is really what made LaGrange the center of the county.
Now, what or where does LaGrange get its name from?
Well, they say the Marquis de Lafayette came through in 1825, I think. Yeah. He visited Kentucky. And, we had a man here, Commodore Richard Taylor, who headed the U.S. Naval Fleet during the Revolutionary War. All those slaveholders and bought a lot of slaves to Oldham County. And remember that guy I was talking about, John Martin Taylor and Elizabeth, the cotton plantation? This was like his nephew, I believe, of Commodore Taylor. Also kin to Zachary Taylor, another big slaveholder, Louisville. So anyway, Marquis de Lafayette was supposedly good friends with the Commodore, visited him here in Oldham County. Grange was supposed to be the name of his farm in France.
Yep. You got a 4 for 4. One more. How many counties? How many counties in Kentucky border Oldham? Which is pretty. You know this one. I mean,
the border Oldham County.
The Kentucky counties. The Kentucky counties.
Yeah. Jefferson, Shelby, Henry, border Oldham County and Trimble.
There you go. 5 for 5. You're the first person to get all 5 correct.
I've been to a lot.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for coming on. Before we sign off here, the podcast, if people want to search for it, what will be the exact title, I guess, so people can search for that when it comes out.
The podcast?
Yeah.
It'd be 30 days of stories on the Underground Railroad in Kentucky.
Okay. And 30 number or 30 word?
30 days of stories.
No, I mean, will it be 30 or 30 or will it be 30 spelled out?
Probably 30 spelled out.
Okay. Just to make sure.
I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
I think it'll be spelled out.
Okay. So where else could they find you if anybody want to connect to you?
Yeah, Oldham County History Center. We're at 106 North 2nd Avenue in LaGrange. We have a beautiful campus we just renovated. We have a wonderful regional museum, archives, library, educational building, all of that. 106 North 2nd, LaGrange, Kentucky. Info at oldhamkyhistory.com. And then we have Oldham County History Center website, and we're also on Facebook and Instagram. All the media stuff.
All the social media stuff. Got to be on the social media.
That's right.
And if you want to buy the book, you can get it on Amazon. You can also get it at the History Press out of South Carolina. You can go to Oldham County History as well.
History Press does a great job for local history. A lot of authors have written for the History Press.
It's and the more history books you can get to, the better. Which my stack of history books keeps getting higher. I don't think there's nothing I can do about that. But
and the History Press, and they also have Arcadia Press. It's the same company, and they do a lot of printing. If you just go to Arcadian History Press, probably you'll be surprised. I bet you that there's a book on every county in Kentucky, a history book that's been sponsored by Arcadian History Press. They really go local on their history. And they're nice books. They're usually paperback,
Mm-hmm.
And the Arcadia does more on photographs, where the History Press is more on transcripts. And
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I have a few. I have Lincoln County's and Rockcastle's kind of, history books, which are pretty good. I also have the big Kentucky encyclopedia.
Yeah, that's
that has a lot of good information. I'll tell them myself. We have a Kentucky History channel that's on YouTube that we put stuff on there as well.
Yeah,
I did a video about Marcus de Lafayette.
Oh, you did?
And at the end of the video, I because I was so used to saying this, I said, he never came to Kentucky. It was just named after him. And of course, as soon as I published it, somebody commented and said, he did come to Kentucky. And I looked in the book and I thought, why didn't I look in the book to see?
Yeah.
But he had a big trip to Kentucky and everything.
Support of the presidency. Remember which president it was he was trying to support, because he was a big war hero.
Mm-hmm.
So he went on kind of a tour.
Mm-hmm.
Big celebration in Lexington and Frankfurt and Louisville.
I'm trying to think right off on which president it would have been. It wouldn't have been Jefferson.
Andrew Jackson.
Maybe Jackson. That would be. It was 1824, 1825 that time. I don't know.
But I don't have my.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Theiss, I really appreciate you coming on the show, talking to us about some Kentucky history and your book. I encourage everybody to go out there and get it and read it. If you want to connect to us, of course, on Facebook, Twitter, @KYHistoryPod. You can email us, thelandbetweenthemeadow@gmail.com. Anything to add before we go?
No, I look forward to having you on our podcast soon.
Well, thanks so much. And don't forget to go check out that podcast. It'll be out in September 1st.
Right.
And so subscribe to it, get it onto your Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to podcasts, so you can listen to a story a day. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you all next time.